Hello and welcome to session 2, looking at doubting climate change, the role of public relations and media in creating doubt around the science behind climate change. This week we're going to be looking specifically into public relations and the industry, the origins of the industry and the way that the industry works to some extent. So with that, I just pulled up a word cloud because people seem quite familiar with this notion of a word cloud around public relations. So what it's telling you is that public relations is the main focus, and then it has a lot of words that are associated with that. And it's kind of interesting when you drill in and look at these things. It's about manipulation, it's about strategy, campaign, marketing, publicity, advertising, press, influence. So this is I guess it's generated around the language that people associate with public relations. And it's kind of interesting to see that about how public relations over the last 100 or so years has morphed into something that it wasn't intended to be at its beginning. So without any further ado, we'll just jump in a little bit to the detail here. But before we get into public relations specifically, what I wanted to do was to put in front of you a basic model of communication. And there are many, many models of communication. And this one's from 1947, developed by Claude Shannon and Weaver. And this is a model that came directly out of the Second World War. And it's a very linear model in terms of explaining how messages are created and transmitted. So bearing in mind it's a very linear model, it was based on the radio technology that was prevalent in the 1940s through the Second World War. And what Shannon in particular was trying to understand is how we communicate and the impact that that communication can have on the way that we behave and the way that we interact with other people. So it's a very linear model, very basic model, and subsequently there are many much more complicated models, much more convoluted models and interactive models. But unless you have a basic understanding right at the beginning, then you're going to get lost a little bit. So I just wanted to put this in front of you and spend a few minutes just going through it so we understand basics of what we're talking about. So in the model, and I've put the model as slightly smaller, but I highlighted the piece that we're going to be speaking about. So the information source is somebody or an entity or an organization who creates a message. And they're creating a message that's usually composed of words, but increasingly we're moving into situations where video is used to communicate with audiences. So again, that becomes more complicated. So in this model, we'll just look at it using language, using words. So the information source is somebody who creates a message. And what they're really trying to understand, if they're a good communicator, is they're trying to consider what the destination needs to know. Not necessarily what they want to know, but what they need to know out of the communication. So they're creating a message in the language that is appropriate for the audience that is going to be receiving the message. The message is then encoded in a particular way for transmission. So if you think about when you're speaking on a phone to somebody, then the technology of the phone is coding your words into a particular electronic format that can get translated, transmitted over wires or through Wi-Fi or cellular signal to a phone at the other end. So whatever the device that's being used, the message is being coded. So as I'm speaking to you now, my voice is the words in my head are the message. My voice is the coding device that I'm using to turn the language in my head into words that I can speak to you in the hopes that you can hear those words and understand them. So coding means a lot of different things. And you have to look at the technology that people are using to understand what it is. So then the message is transmitted as a signal. In this case, my voice is the signal. I'm transmitting the words through my voice. So the air that I'm breathing and that's coming out of my larynx is the signal that's coming to the microphone and the camera that's recording this. So then there's a receiver. So the signal that I'm transmitting travels through a medium. In this case, again, the medium is the air between myself and the microphone, and then it's the microphone and all the electronics behind that are coding the signal that ends up in the video that you're seeing. So whatever signal is created, it travels through a medium. And then it's received by a device at the other end. So if I was talking to you physically in this room, the device that's the receiver would be your ear. because it would receive the airwaves that my voice are creating, the words, it would be, the air pressure would be hitting your eardrums, and that would be the receiver. So once received, a signal is decoded. Again, lots of different ways of decoding depending on the technology that we're using. And then it arrives at the destination. So the destination in this case is inside your head. So my words are inside your head, and your brain is dealing with them in whichever way your brain wants to deal with them. So this is fundamental communication the model as created by Shannon Weaver in 1947 to help try to understand how as a species we communicate. Sources of confusion in this process, because quite often the words that I say are not what you think you hear. So we have to look at sources of confusion. And bearing in mind, this model was developed around radio signals. And in the early days of radio, there was a lot of interference because of the technology. So quite often the noise in the system, and you can see the noise at the bottom square, the noise in the system came from physical noise that was created, or electronic noise that was created by the machinery of the transmission, or the machinery that was around the transmission. So noise can be that kind of aspect. Then we have to think, was the message encoded accurately and appropriately for its intended audience? And this is kind of an interesting thing as well, particularly when one's looking at government or scientific communication, because quite often scientists will write in language or use language that is appropriate for a scientific audience. So when I was doing my PhD research, I was working with school children, and it was very clear to me that the language that institutions use to create messaging to school kids was largely inaccessible to them, because they couldn't understand what the words meant in the way that a scientist understood the words. So there was a real gap around that. So it was confusing for people to listen to messages, which is why quite often they weren't adhered to. So you have to encode a message in a way that is appropriate for the audience. You have to understand what their literacy levels are. You have to understand what their intention, what their engagement is with the whole process, etc. Lots of different things that one has to consider in the encoding. So if there's confusion, it's not necessarily because people haven't understood the words you've said, it's because the words don't mean anything to them. And then we have to think, was the medium appropriate for both the message and its intended audience? And again, sometimes there's a mismatch, and you see politicians sometimes choosing to use social media platforms where they're completely inept at understanding how to use these platforms. So people look at it and they think, this is a politician who's just trying to get my vote, and it doesn't work. They just make fun of the politician. And then, was the message decoded accurately and appropriately for its intended audience? So you see here, there's various things that can get in the way of understanding of the message. Even a simple message can be misunderstood by an audience. And it's the responsibility of the source to make sure that the message is understood appropriately by the intended audience. There are other sources of confusion. I've already touched on one of the sources of confusion being noise in the medium and how this affects the transmission. But in specific relation to this video series, we also have the creation of doubt, and the creation of doubt around scientific communication. So if we think of the process here, you have the information source, which is the scientist. When they're coding their messages, hopefully they're doing it in a language that is accessible to a popular audience rather than a scientific audience, and quite often mistakes are made at that point. But then you have this notion of doubt coming into the medium. So there's the injection of doubt into a conversation. And this is what we're going to be looking at in this series again. It's how public relations and how the media allow the creation of doubt that then becomes noise in the process, and that adds to confusion, and it leads to people distrusting or not believing the message that is coming from the scientific establishment. So it's quite an important concept to have. So hopefully I've covered that enough, and we're good to go with that. So then just a little bit of theory around mass communication. And there are a couple of theories that came into being at the beginning of mass communication. So this is really the beginning of the radio era. Before television, we had large-scale newspapers. So the consolidation of newspaper industries into national titles is part of the beginning of mass communication. And then also the rise of radio and TV. And there are two theories around that, the magic bullet theory or the hypodermic syringe theory. They're both essentially the same. And the notion was there that the message that I have, the institution that I represent, whatever, the message that I have is being communicated, transmitted through the mass media, and it's going directly into your brain as the audience. And it seems quite straightforward because people are listening to the voices coming out of their radios, and so therefore they would believe what's being said to them. For many 20 or 30 years, this was an accepted theory of how mass communication worked. However, in 1948, Paul Lazarsfeld came up with this idea of a two-step flow model. And in this, you have the origin of the message, which is, in this case, is going to be a scientist. And then the message goes out into the ether, if you will. But it's directed mainly towards opinion leaders within various elements in society. And then those opinion leaders within society transmit the message, cascade it down to people who are influenced by those people, by those leaders, if you will, whatever role they play in society. And this, with experimental testing through the 1940s, through the 1950s, this became a much more accepted, if basic, model of how mass communication works. So it relies on this notion of an opinion leader. To update this a little bit, what we've seen recently over the last 10 or so years is how social media has become a way of communication using a new tool in a way that doesn't conform to the traditional roles, and it allows the creation of something new. So what's happened with social media is, in this two-step flow model, is instead of having a homogenized whole where everybody's listening to the same message, you've ended up with this notion of echo chambers. So you've got two completely different takes on the same messaging, if you will, and two completely different belief systems built around those. So here it's represented by these, the red and the blue clusters, and I'm not trying to represent political parties here, but it's just to show how these things end up being, you start out with good intentions and it ends up being really divisive because of the nature of the scientific communication, but also the doubt that the particular interests have in undermining the evidence that's being placed without denying it. So to go a little bit to the origins of public relations, in the late 19th century, you had, late 19th century, early 20th century, in the progressive areas, the US was known at the time, you had a series of reform-minded journalists who were trying to investigate institutional wrongdoing and corruption, and trying to, because they believed that the more widespread the information that these institutions were corrupt and that politicians were doing bad things, the more widespread that was, it would lead to a cleaning up of society. So they were trying to hold institutions and powerful people to account. They were known collectively as the muckrakers, and they published their work in sensationalist publications such as McClure's magazine, which was kind of a widespread magazine sold quite across the US. And in some ways, you can see this as a precursor for things like National Enquirer, which publishes nonsense nowadays, but it still has a certain audience that believe the stories that are published in it. So this is part of what was happening at the beginning of end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So this is the nascent industry. It wasn't known as public relations, but it was trying to hold people to account. And then you had this guy, Ivy Lee, who came along, and he worked in, I guess we'd call it marketing nowadays. And the picture on the screen is of the 1906 Atlantic City Railway tragedy. So the train crashed, lots of people were killed. And Ivy Lee was working with the railroad company, and he saw that there was a lot of outrage about the death that was caused and the injuries that were caused and the damage to people and property. And he came up with the notion of the company, the train company, creating what we would call now a press release, making a statement and putting it out into the public domain, saying this is what has happened, these are the facts about what's happened, and this is what we're doing about it. So it was a development of this notion of corporate accountability that came from the muckrakers, but this was the first time that an organization had created a communication device that was intended to quell people's unrest and questioning the safety of railways generally. And at that time, railways were the prime means of transportation that the United States had to cover the vast distances between coastal cities, etc. So it was really important for the development of the economy that people trusted the train system. So Ivy League came up with this idea of creating what's now known as a press release, so that the corporation could actually create a channel by which it could speak to the public and try to set their minds at rest. So he was one of the first people to ever do this, and he didn't see what he was doing as described by the notion of public relations. But that left the door open for somebody to come in and create an industry around this notion of corporations talking to the public. So into that vacuum, that void, if you will, stepped a guy called Edward Bernays. And Bernays is interesting because he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud being the scientist who originated the whole discipline of psychoanalysis. And Bernays benefited from the popularity around his uncle's work. And we have to look at the times in which this was happening, the end of the First World War, moving into the 1920s, and the Great Depression in 1929, or the crash, Wall Street crash and the Depression, then the Second World War. So this was all happening then. Psychoanalysis was a discipline that was coming to the fore. And Bernays, in that psychoanalysis, Freud was primarily working in Europe. So Bernays could take his uncle's theories and apply them to a business world, a business setting. And he gained a lot of credibility. He was riffing off his uncle's name and his uncle's work. But he also had access to, because of that, he had access to a lot of the major corporations in the United States. And so he created this organization that was looking at becoming a public council, public relations organization, dealing with companies communicating with publics. He also did work for the government, and he was involved at some level in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 that ended the end of the First World War. So he had some connections to government as well. So Sigmund Freud is the guy in the center here. He was deeply troubled by what he saw happened in the First World War. He believed that before the First World War, he believed that human beings were innately good, and that we thought that sort of the development of society and the betterment of everybody was at the core of society and civilization. And he was really confused by the brutality of the First World War and confused by how scientific minds could turn their creativity to creating weapons of mass destruction. And so he was really confused him, and I'm being fairly simplistic in this. He's written a lot that you should read if you're interested in that explains his whole process. So I'm really paraphrasing and cherry picking here because of trying to explain how public relations was developed and how the Bernaysian version of public relations became the norm. So Freud noted the tensions between individual desires and societal conformity. So for us to cohere as a society, as a civilization, we need to work together. But to work together, then I have to maybe not fulfill my own individual desires. I have to conform to some societal norms, societal standards, whatever. And Freud considered the need of an external sources of control to maintain equilibrium in society. And this is kind of interesting, this notion of an external source of control. And Bernays took this idea, and it was in his mind for, I guess, a decade or so before it manifested itself greatly. But give an indication of some of the early work that Bernays did. He worked with tobacco companies. 1929, immediately before the Wall Street crash that led to the Great Depression. Traditionally, if you're interested in the history of cigarette smoking, up until the First World War, most people hand-rolled their cigarettes because of the need for soldiers to have cigarettes with them, because that's what soldiers needed in wartime, I guess. There was a development of machines that would roll cigarettes. And so what we understand as commercially available cigarettes now were a development of the First World War. But cigarette smoking was primarily a masculine trait. Polite women didn't smoke. If you were a woman and you smoked, you weren't a member of polite society, let's put it that way. And there are a lot of media cartoons, media representations of women of ill repute or whatever who were smoking, and how men didn't appreciate that. And so Bernays was tasked with, by the tobacco companies, of trying to open the door to women, for the acceptability of women to smoke. And so he hit upon this notion of calling a cigarette a torch of freedom. And so he placed adverts and in a lot of newspapers saying that a march was going to take place at a particular time in a particular place in various cities around the United States, where women were encouraged to march as they were smoking. And this was seen as something liberating for women. It was taking control of an action on their own bodies that wasn't going to be controlled by men anymore. You might see some parallels with where we are in the 21st century over different issues. So Bernays came up with this really clever device that was simple. It was a mass movement that he manipulated people into participating with, manipulated in not necessarily a bad way in that case. And it was very effective. So the Torches of Freedom marches took place, and women recognized that they had a choice whether they smoked or not. It wasn't dependent on what their male counterparts felt. So the tobacco companies saw a very big increase in the volume of women smoking. So they were very happy with that. It increased their revenues and their profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. So they found Bernays' work to be very, very useful to them. And the tobacco industry is very influential in the corporate world in America. So because Bernays was so successful in that, it opened doors for him to be successful in other areas. And here you see a photograph in the middle of I guess, a fairly upmarket woman walking down the street with a dog and smoking, being looked at by other women who are uncertain whether they should be part of the march or not. So it shows how Bernays managed to get people to do something that benefited him and the companies he represented, by appealing to something that they saw as beneficial for themselves. You have to remember this was at a time where women weren't necessarily enfranchised, so they weren't allowed to vote in many countries. So women were coming out from underneath that at the end of the First World War. And so this notion of freedom for women, emancipation for women, was extremely powerful and extremely effective. So that's all we've got time for in this session. So thank you very much for watching. And I look forward to seeing you in our next session, where we're going to be continuing the way we look at the work of Edward Bernays.